Let's continue where we left off in the last video. We now have our clothes mesh in Blender and can continue to add details and model the rest of the outfit. Before we do that, I wanted to show you how you can approach creating clothes in Blender in case you don't use Marvelous Designer at all in your pipeline. To be honest, this is something you can approach in 1,000 different ways. Creating the high poly cloth mesh is absolutely independent of your character model and your choice of software. You can use Blender, ZBrush, 3D Code, Maya or Max. Basically, this is just straight up modeling and sculpting to create whatever you want. I mean, you can start with a cube and sculpt your clothes from scratch, or you can use polygonal modeling techniques or actual cloth simulation. There are, for example, a couple of add-ons available on Blender Market for cloth simulation. The native Blender cloth simulation is very basic, but you can use it as a starting point and then refine the mesh with modeling or sculpting tools. What I would like to do in this video though, is to quickly go over two different approaches that I sometimes use in Blender to get a basic clothes shape to start with. The first approach is to use the character mesh and duplicate parts of the mesh to be used as clothes. Since our MetaHuman character comes from a game engine, the mesh is triangulated. And since quads are much more convenient to select edge loops, extrude and so on, we can convert the mesh to quads by using the tris to quads function. The result is usually not perfect, but we can still work with that. Now select the mesh part that you want, for example a t-shirt shape. Then duplicate the mesh and press P to separate it from the body. Then you can clean it up a bit. For example, I want the bottom edge to be zeroed out in the Z-axis. Select the edge loop, press S to scale, then Z to select the Z-axis and type 0. Then we want to smooth the mesh a bit. You can go into sculpt mode and either smooth the areas you want manually by using the smooth brush, or use the mesh filter to smooth the whole mesh. Select smooth in the drop-down menu, then left-click somewhere in the viewport and drag your mouse to the right while holding the left mouse button. You can also use the mesh filter to inflate the shirt or just scale it up in edit mode. But be careful in areas like the armpits where you might get overlapping geometry. Use the smooth brush to smooth it out if needed. Repeat the process to create pants, stockings, gloves or whatever you want to make. The second approach I want to show you is to use Blender's cloth simulation tool. Let's create a plane and subdivide it a couple of times. And delete these faces. So this will be the front part of our pants. To get the back part, let's extrude the whole mesh along the y-axis. Next, we need to create sewing lines. The way it works in Blender is by creating edges that connect the front and back of the cloth mesh. In X-ray mode, you can select all the faces here and then delete only faces. This will leave the connecting edges intact. Now let's delete the edges we don't need for the torso and the legs. We can now activate the cloth physics in the Physics Properties tab. To activate the sewing, go to the Shape section and activate the sewing checkbox. Let's set the sewing force to 15. We want the clothes to collide with the body, so we need to make the body mesh a collision object. Now we can press the spacebar to start the simulation. If you want the clothes to be closer to the body, you can decrease the outer and inner thickness and the collision settings of the body. Well, it looks like the simulation is creating problems in the crotch area, so we probably need to increase the resolution of the mesh. If we subdivide it again, we will have to recreate our sewing edges as well. You can also add a subdivision modifier to see how it would look like with more resolution. Okay, I think this is good enough for me, so let's apply the cloth modifier and close the gaps between the front and back part. You can either merge the vertices manually or by distance, or use the bridge edge loop function, which usually produces better results. You have already seen how you can smooth the mesh in sculpt mode, but you can also use the smooth vertices operation in edit mode. Go to Vertex and choose Smooth Vertices. This gives you a bit more control over the smoothing strength, number of iterations, and which axis should be considered. Since I want to still retain some of the clothes shape, I uncheck the Z-axis. So those were the two approaches I wanted to show you to create a basic shape. From here on, you can, for example, use the multi-resolution modifier to sculpt folds and other details. I won't take it much further in this video, but just to show you one more thing, you can use alpha brushes if you want. Create a new texture and click on Open. For example, I have this Folds Brushes pack I bought on ArtStation a while ago. Select the brush, then set Stroke to, for example, Drag Dot, and the texture to View Plane. Now you can use this texture as a height map if you want to sculpt some folds. I use the same process to create a vest. If you have areas where the body clips through the clothes, an easy way to fix this is to use the inflate brush. Well, alright then. How you proceed from here is entirely your choice. I will go back to my outfit from Marvelous Designer and continue from there. To complete the outfit, I first create some shoes. Nothing sophisticated, just a simple model. We will add details in the texturing process later. As I said before, this modeling part is totally arbitrary and is in no way specific to or the focus of the customization workflow of the MetaHuman characters. So I will speed this up and briefly comment on what I'm doing. Create a plane, resize it and apply a subdivision modifier. Add loop cuts and shape it to roughly fit the foot. Add a solidify modifier to give it some thickness. Then add a cube and use the same techniques to roughly shape it to enclose the foot. I then just basically duplicate parts of the mesh, separate them and pull them in place in sculpt or edit mode. Pro tip: if you want to apply all modifiers on multiple objects, you can select them all and then use Convert to Mesh. Add a mirror modifier to create the second shoe. Next, let's add some accessories. The cape needs to be held in place by some buttons, and I want the character to have a shoulder pad with fur. Use the hair particle system to create the fur and groom it in particle edit mode. To create objects like belts, I use the shrink wrap modifier so the belts fit the body nicely. Create a cylinder and delete the top and bottom faces. Then scale and position it such that it is fully inside the body mesh. For the wrap method, choose Project and play with the offset to bring the belt out. Then add Solidify and Subdivision modifiers. For the belt buckle, I use the wireframe modifier here to get the basic shape. And since I haven't applied the modifiers on the belt yet, I can add edges and create a hole for the buckle. Finally, I model a bracelet and then begin working on the helmet. As I have shown you before, I duplicate a part of the head mesh to start with and then use the popular mirror technique to continue modeling and shaping the helmet to its final form. As a final touch, I add a necklace. Well, that's all I want to add to our hero character. Now let's take a quick break and talk about a very important question. What do we need to think about when we work on our character? There are two things that should be in the back of your mind when you make decisions on what type of clothes and props you want to add. The first is a minor point, which is resolution. You will need a low poly version of every mesh that you create. For some objects like the belts or buttons, I don't even make a high poly version and rather add details through the textures. But if you would like to sculpt details, there are two things you can do to avoid having to retopologize every object later. One is to make a copy of the low-res version before you begin adding details. This way you get your low poly version for free. The other one is to use the multi-res modifier, so you can go back to your original model at any time. The second point to always have in mind is one that has massive implications for your clothes model, which is movement. We are not making a static sculpture. This is an animated character, so everything we attach will move with it. You basically have 4 options to attach something to the character body. One is rigging and skinning. 2 is rigging and cloth simulation in engine. 3 is a static mesh. And 4 is a skeletal mesh with its own rig for physics simulation in the engine. We will look into all these options later. The most important one is the first one, rigging and skinning, because most of the clothes components will be skinned, including the hard surface elements like the cape buttons here. You can't just add them as static meshes to the character blueprint because they would clip through the clothes and body. So it's important to consider how the character mesh is deforming when we place props on the body. Avoid placing elements that would stay rigid in real life on areas with high deformation probability like elbows, knees, shoulders or the waist. For example, rigid objects like pouches or armor pieces around the waistline are a common design element but will give you trouble. The same goes for metal knee pads and things like that. You can adjust the way such elements deform in weight painting and usually get away with a little deformation, but sometimes you will run into serious problems. Elements like headgear, on the other hand, are usually not problematic since the head does not deform. Helmets, goggles and similar objects can be just added as static meshes. Another common issue is wide clothing. It's tempting to add wide coats, capes and stuff like that, but it's sometimes close to impossible to make it look good during animation in Unreal Engine, except if you go for the Alembic workflow and import a simulated cloth animation from Marvelous Designer. So out of the 4 options mentioned above, skinning is the easiest to implement and gives consistent and good-looking results for animation. So as a general rule for skinned clothing, the closer you keep to the body, the better. Garment items like our cape here will be skinned because we want the top part to move with the shoulders and the spine, but for the lower part we will have to use cloth physics. To sum up, there is no right or wrong way to design and model clothes. Every outfit will have its own challenges and issues depending on the design and topology. Don't be afraid to take risks and experiment. Over time you will develop an intuition on what will work and what won't. Alright. In the next video, I would like to go over some final questions on this part of the clothes creation pipeline, such as file organization, optimization, how and when to add thickness, and the question of details. And then we will proceed to retopology in Chapter 6.